I honestly don't know what it would take to get them to completely withdraw from Ukraine under this leadership, because that is such a de facto admission of total failure. It's hard to see how Putin, a person who launched that operation, could survive, and therefore it just seems implausible that he would agree to that. What we're really talking about is what are the conditions for a potential ceasefire, and are there terms under any ceasefire and then leading into a broader peace deal that see the Russians give up more territory than they currently hold.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Matthew Savill, RUSI's Director of Military Sciences. Matthew, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Good afternoon.
Pokrovsk has been a focus of Russia's offensive in the Donbass for over a year now, almost. How should we read Russia's failure to seize that city?
Well, it's a sign of both some of the strengths and advantages that the Russians have, and some of the weaknesses of their operations over the past 12 months. I mean, on the failure side, it is clearly part of Ukrainian territory that they would have been hoping and expected to have captured by now. We shouldn't just measure their progress in terms of land. They're trying to do other things as well in terms of, breaking Ukrainian resistance, but they have paid an inordinately high cost for the advances that they have made. And similarly, further north, they haven't taken the so-called fortress belt. Some of the other settlements and cities and towns, places like Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. And so the Ukrainians have done an excellent job of holding up and minimizing those advances. I think to counter that, though, the rate of Russian advance has picked up in the past 2 months compared to the months before that. They have also started adopting what they're trying to do, so a bit less in terms of frontal assault, a bit more probing for weaknesses, trying infiltration. The front lines have begun to blur. They're also beginning to extend around, envelop some of these areas, and effectively impose a different cost on the Ukrainian defenders by either cutting their supply lines or increasing the risk in terms of providing resupply. Essentially getting fire control over the area, such as they can begin to inflict casualties and pain that the Ukrainians will find it harder to take.
So it is important, though, then, that Ukraine is still able to use groups like Azov Army Corps as a sort of reserve force to come in and counter some of those probing attacks that you talk about.
Yes, I think one of the big concerns over the past year has been the extent to which the Ukrainians used up a lot of their reserves for the Kursk incursion, and the fact that their personnel pressures mean that in many cases the front line is quite thinly held. You have small pockets of Ukrainian personnel, so often quite long distances from one another in foxholes, bolt holes, fortified positions, and that has contributed to this blurring of the front lines. So one of the challenges of analysing the conflict, even for our people who go out, is that you don't really have what I think some people imagine, which are these very firmly defined front lines, trenches. People are kind of using First World War analogies. Actually, what you're seeing is much more of an intermingling of the fronts, sometimes fighting past each other. And the Russians in particular are trying to get through with these very small numbers of people, sneaking through in the dead of night to build up positions to then attack. So I think the fact that there are still reserves there that they're able to move around is obviously positive, but it doesn't have large volumes of free personnel. And what the Russians are doing is pressing in multiple places at once. So we have talked a lot about Pokrovsk and the Donbass. There is pressure in the north, particularly building up in Kharkiv, and there is still activity in the south around Zaporizhia, even though progress there is equally incredibly slow.
Yeah, and so where does this overall leave Russia's offensive in the Donbass? We know that's pretty much now the main focus of this conflict for Putin.
There was a lot of talk of a Russian summer offensive, and in truth, that never really materialized as a single large-scale operation. Instead, what you had was this constant probing and pressure along a broader front, but with the Donbass as its focus. We're probably going to still see Russian attempts to find weak points, and as I say, infiltrate, identify where they can bring more firepower to bear. And that's because they do still have a personnel advantage, although they are becoming stretched. They also are facing some materiel shortages, but what they have done is eke out more time for their advances by minimizing their use of armored vehicles, being more callous with their people. And we shouldn't forget that the Russian Air Force is still playing an important role in using glide bombs and other air attacks to, if you like, break Ukrainian strong points or try and put them under pressure. And that's with the drone battle that is going on and around the front, the point of contact, making it very difficult to maneuver, and meaning that large-scale assaults are very difficult to prepare, mass, and then launch.
And this is not a single front conflict, of course. There are other areas where in Ukraine where battles continue. We had heard from Kiev. They claimed that they had managed to stabilize the line in Sumy, that region adjacent to Russia's Kursk Oblast. What do we know about the battle there?
Yes, that seems to have, as you say, stabilized. Russian advances there have not amounted to much. Indeed, it looks like the Ukrainians have been able to push them back. So that's contained, although it does mean that there is a commitment of forces there that, as we said, the Ukrainians would quite like to have as a reserve elsewhere. I think the situation in Kharkiv is problematic because the Russians can fire into the city or launch drones into the city. They are pressing around Kupiansk. That's uncomfortable. It's another example of where they're infiltrating in and around Ukrainian positions, and it's another headache in terms of the defense, even if the Ukrainians have been able to inflict considerable casualties there as well.
Well, away from the front lines of this conflict itself, earlier this week, we saw a somewhat dramatic shift, at least in rhetoric, from Donald Trump, the US president. But what action should we actually watch for that could show us there has really been a shift in the White House on this conflict?
I'm a little bit skeptical about a apparent major shift in Trump's position because we've heard this before. Indeed, we've had repeated threats about sanctions and future action and deadlines on the Russians, none of which have amounted to very much at all. The change in tone, more critical of Russia, more positive about Ukraine, I think will be welcomed in some senses, in that it means that there is at least not obvious public pressure from the US. But there is a danger that this is actually cover for President Trump and the US beginning to step back a little bit, wash their hands of the conflict. In some respects, him describing Russia as a paper tiger and wishing Ukraine well is potentially indicative of a line that would then pivot to saying, so you, Ukraine, and you, Europe, can deal with this problem and you don't really need the US anymore. Is it worth my time investing in a diplomatic track that isn't going very far? I think what we would look out for as a minimum is that the mechanism that was created whereby Europeans could buy more equipment from the US remains open. That is positive because it addresses some of the capability shortfalls that the Ukrainians have. What it isn't, though, is a solution to the problem of the massive support that the Ukrainians need. Now, there's a lot that they need to do themselves in terms of mobilization and training, where international support could help, but that's in the first place, the onus is on the Ukrainians. But there is also the issue of the volume of support. The Europeans have increased that support from where they were 18 months ago, but you've got to remember they're providing about half by value of that support. And US material support and training and other activity is beginning to drop off now. It won't actually end for a little while because some of the orders that were placed to buy equipment to give to Ukraine will take some time to fulfill, potentially running actually into next year. But unless the Europeans are proposing doubling their spending, and they're not, that still means a net shortfall compared to support in the latter half of the Biden administration. So there is a question of, can the Europeans do more? And alternatively, can they provide more effective and efficient support?
As part of that shift, at least in the rhetoric, Trump has said he now believes Ukraine can retake all of that territory taken since 2022. Of course, Russia would have us believe that's impossible. I know dealing in absolutes is difficult and perhaps unrealistic when it comes to military analysis, but who's closer to the truth there?
In the near term, by which we mean the next couple of years, militarily retaking all of the territory that Ukraine has lost, and by that you could mean Crimea and everything in the east, so going back to 2014, is essentially, that's not plausible based on the likely balance of forces and what the Ukrainians could achieve and the kind of military pressure and change to their tactics and capabilities that they would need. That's not saying it could never happen, but there's little prospect in the near term. What they would potentially be hoping is that they don't have to fight that the Russians would choose to pull back. That seems equally fanciful given the extent to which Putin has put his reputation on this, the sunk costs, Russian pride, and their interests. That would be a complete repudiation of a decade's worth of policy and fighting. In truth, what you would need to roll back the Russians is a combination of military pressure and economic and financial pain that change the calculations in Moscow, both on the internal Russian economy and their viability in terms of exports and doing global business, such as that they themselves dialed back their ambitions. I honestly don't know what it would take to get them to completely withdraw from Ukraine under this leadership, because that is such a de facto admission of total failure. It's hard to see how Putin, a person who launched that operation, could survive, and therefore it just seems implausible that he would agree to that. What we're really talking about is, what are the conditions for a potential ceasefire, and are there terms under any ceasefire and then leading into a broader peace deal that see the Russians give up more territory than they currently hold?
We spoke before about Europe's willingness and ability to keep supplying Ukraine militarily. A lot of that is going to be done certainly for the foreseeable with American weapons. But what is the state of Europe's defense industry? There's this notion they've put forward that they are ramping up. But I was reading RUSI's report on the risks of the EU's environmental, social, and governance standards. Maybe not hampering progress. Where are the Europeans on their capability to produce the weapons needed to deter Russia?
Well, on that latter point, actually, what the research shows is that in many respects, it's over-regulation and other policies that are really the part of the challenge, rather than the zealous application of particular standards. Broadly speaking, and this is a very sweeping judgment, European defence industry is now stepping up. We are seeing new factories being planned or opening. So there is increased shell production, partly to compensate for what the Ukrainians need and what European militaries need. We have seen the announcement of new missile production. So existing lines are being expanded. And for example, in the case of the UK, we're going to start producing new Storm Shadow missiles, those air-launched cruise missiles that we've given to the Ukrainians. Whereas up until now, what we've mostly been doing is refurbishing existing ones. So that there is work underway. However, the scale of the challenge is considerable. And actually, in terms of industrial production, So before we even get onto the funding that is available, European militaries are, of course, rearming themselves as well as supplying Ukraine. And so capacity has to meet two demands, both for supply to Ukraine and internal rearmament and stockpiling. And in and amongst that, there's not just produce more of what you have already, there is innovation and produce new weapons. So Europe is actually producing more drones as well of various different types: surveillance, decoy, and strike. But the demand for that is ferocious. The good news is that Ukrainian industry in some areas is doing a lot of this itself. So they have increased the proportion of weapons that they are using that are produced by Ukrainian companies. I think the figure they've given is now more than 40%. They could produce the overwhelming majority of the 4.5 million drones, mostly first person view drones, that they say they need. The issue there is capital. They don't actually have the money to buy all of it. So Europe could step in there as well. I mean, overall, we are still probably several years away from really high levels of European defence industrial production. And there's a lot they'll have to do to deconflict internally. But they have finally started, even if it's years late.
Well, we talk about European support for Ukraine. Ironically, there are now discussions around Ukrainian troops training Polish NATO soldiers in the use of interceptor drones and other pieces of equipment and tactics to counter Russian Shahed drones after those incursions early this month into Poland and also into Romania. Where does an effective deterrent lie, do you think, to those incursions? Is it in that kind of cheap, direct shoot down capability, or a larger, more dramatic gesture from NATO itself?
In terms of these air incursions, and we should remember that Russian activity in and around NATO airspace is not a new phenomenon. They've spent years, since the early 2000s, they reactivated some of their long-range bomber flights. Those were into what's known as the NATO air policing area. So it's not necessarily going into countries' airspace, but it's flying in the area that NATO polices. But the context of the recent incursions is, of course, a significant drone incursion and hundreds of weapons being launched at Ukraine, and occasional incidents where some of those have crossed into Poland or Romania. Preventing that requires both the capability to deal with air incursions and a demonstration of the willingness to do so. So for conventional aircraft, that's actually activity with which NATO countries are very familiar. It's standard air policing. For drones or other cruise missiles, it's a demonstration that they have the ability to tackle larger scale incursions or incidents. And particularly on the drone front, that is a challenge for NATO at the moment. We've got ground-based air defenses, missiles. We could put combat aircraft to shoot things down with expensive missiles, but that requires volume and in some cases novel systems, directed energy, microwaves, electronic warfare, lasers, most of which NATO isn't deploying at the moment and needs to do so. Because if it wants to credibly say we could handle a large-scale incident, it needs to think in the realm of hundreds, which is what Ukraine is facing, rather than little more than a dozen, which is what went into Poland the other week.
And we heard out of the US as well, Donald Trump saying that NATO should shoot down Russian aircraft if they make these sort of dramatic violations of NATO airspace. We've discussed that a little bit there, but ultimately, do you think NATO is capable and willing of shooting down Russian jets or warplanes over their territories?
I think it is, but what it will want to do is actually develop and demonstrate, if you like, a series of escalatory steps that give Russia the opportunity to back down. You don't want to go immediately from NATO sort of escorts aircraft to we're going to shoot down anything that sticks its nose over the border into our airspace. And so they will want to have developed and demonstrate rules of engagement, as they're known, which allow for those kind of escalatory steps, which are very rapid interception of aircraft coming in. So they're met by something. And then, if you like, the warning signs that create the rules of the game so that Russia knows it will be met promptly, but that it has the option to therefore back down and pull away and pull back. And if anything happens, NATO will be able to say, this was very clear, the rules were very clear, your pilots ignored warnings, they ignored signs, and in essence, NATO is the one that is responsibly patrolling airspace rather than the Russians. And I think a lot of people will be thinking back to the incident over the Black Sea 2 years ago, where allegedly a Russian jet actually released a missile intending to fire it at a UK surveillance aircraft. And we were just fortunate that the missile malfunctioned.
And just finally, Matthew, how much of a threat do these Russian incursions represent? I mean, we were speaking to George Barros from the Institute of the Study of War last week on Frontline, who characterized this as being phase one of Putin's war against Europe. Is that too strong of a message?
It's a little strong, but the point is we don't actually know. And if we don't put up a robust response, if we do not deter, actually that will contribute to the Russians probably testing us more, being more assertive and more aggressive. You could look upon these incidents as being part of a pattern of behavior intended to see where political appetite is in NATO member countries at the moment, where there are gaps, where some people are not prepared to put their money where their mouth is, or those who, broadly speaking, think this isn't an issue to begin with. And therefore, I think having a NATO operation there, Eastern Sentry, is a good start. But they will want to now begin demonstrating a firmer intent to tackle these more promptly, because otherwise it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So not escalating unnecessarily, not panicking, and certainly not being too sensitive, but essentially doing what NATO says it will do as a minimum, which is defend its own airspace. And I think if that is done, and I would add that, for example, in some of the other events that are being talked about elsewhere with drones, we have no confirmation of what those involve yet, so we shouldn't leap to conclusions. But if that is done across the board, I think Russia will see that this is not a fruitful path, because as much as people have pointed out, Europe is not prepared to fight Russia over Ukraine. Russia itself has demonstrated that it is not trying to start a war with NATO, because that is a war, particularly if it pulls US forces and US air power in, that Russia loses.
Well, Matthew Savill, Director of Military Sciences at the Royal United Services Institute, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
My pleasure.